Texas Governor Greg Abbott is asking President Biden to declare a major disaster declaration after massive winter storms brought devastation to his state's power grid. Officials with ERCOT admit they were just moments away from the entire collapse of the energy grid, which could have potentially left millions of people in the dark for months. They say the only reason they avoided that was because of the rolling blackouts they implemented. But the problems keep piling up for many Texans. Along with the outages, freezing temperatures have caused water pipes to burst, leading to flooding. Even fires are an issue. Some crews report they've been unable to aggressively battle flames due to low water pressure. This all comes as a recent piece in the Texas Tribune, which has been doing tremendous reporting on what's happening in the state. In a new piece in the Texas Tribune, it claims state leaders knew winter storms could leave the electric grid vulnerable, but that they left the choice to prepare up to the power companies. Erin Douglas is in Louisville, Kentucky. She's an environmental reporter for the Texas Tribune and one of the authors of that article. Again, Erin, I'm so grateful for the reporting that your paper has been doing throughout this crisis, because it really has been valuable to people all across the country who are trying to understand what's going on in Texas. So let's start with why Texas has its own power grid. I think many of us who don't live in Texas, we're not aware of that. So explain how the state was able to gain independence from the rest of the nation and avoid federal regulation. And I hope it's not as simple as, don't mess with Texas, like we do our own thing.
Right. Well, this goes back several decades, and so it's historically been pretty isolated. And the reason is because by not crossing state lines, Texas utilities avoided being subject to certain federal rules. That has come under some criticism during this crisis, because while Texas's grid does have some connectivity to Mexico and to the eastern U.S. grid, those ties are pretty small, they're pretty limited on what they can transmit. And so that became a problem during this crisis, experts told me, because other grids couldn't really help us out that much when we were really needing additional supplies of energy to our grid. So that is potentially something that experts say policymakers might look at.
And as I sort of understand it, when you talk about how Texas became independent in this way, is they also were in a very unique situation where they were able to create a large amount of energy, and they also had consumers to purchase a large amount of energy. So there wasn't a need to buy energy from elsewhere or have excess energy that you could then sell. It was this perfect little sort of self-contained business. But now what we're hearing from many officials, at least very early on, particularly Governor Abbott, is pointing the finger at some of these green alternatives. But there's been a lot of debate about just how we know that, there's certainly some of the infrastructure froze. But when we're looking at windmills and solar, I mean, just how much blame should they be taking for this?
Right, that's become a huge source of debate. And it's really important to understand that every source of energy in Texas struggled in the storm earlier this week. Many of the plants are not set up to withstand this sort of extreme cold that Texas endured. And Texas is an energy state. We produce the most amount of natural gas in the U.S. We produce the most amount of wind power. And natural gas in particular struggled during this crisis. They had severe problems because production of natural gas went way down when wells froze and we weren't able to get natural gas out of the ground. We couldn't get it transported to the natural gas-fired power plants that produce the energy. And even those plants had problems with lines freezing, components freezing, and they weren't able to operate. And so we even had a nuclear plant go offline for a time during this crisis. And so it's really important to understand, windmills, yes, wind turbines, yes, they were freezing. But many other sources of energy also really struggled during this storm, and natural gas is a huge component of that because Texas relies so heavily in the winter on natural gas.
Erin, former U.S. Energy Secretary and Texas Governor Rick Perry says Texans would rather go without electricity than give the federal government more power over the state. The Washington Post had a heartbreaking story about an 11-year-old boy, Christian Pavone, who went to bed. He was 11 years old. He went to bed in an unheated Texas home, and he died. And the authorities suspect it was hypothermia. Didn't complain. He, like most children, never do, especially when they're cold. You never really hear kids complain. He went to bed just like he did every night, and he didn't wake up. His parents tried to wake him up, and he didn't wake up. And I just cried reading this story because this is the United States of America, and to have a child of that age die of hypothermia in his own home, and then to hear Rick Perry say, yeah, Texans would rather go without electricity than give the federal government power over their state. I don't know about this is not a political discussion. It's more of a question about the mentality of how people think about power, electricity in the state of Texas.
Right. I mean, Texas is a energy state, and I think that Texans want reliability of the grid. I mean, every Texan who went through this crisis this week wants reliability of the grid. These are heartbreaking stories. These are stories that, should never happen again. And I think that ultimately, we're having some of our state leadership call for review. Governor Abbott just recently called for some winterizing of the grid, which would potentially prepare some of these power plants from such extreme weather. And so I don't think that Texans, are willing to sacrifice having power and heat or anything like that in order to avoid regulation. I think that there's going to be some hard looks at ERCOT and the state's framework for regulating to make sure that this never happens again in Texas.
So throughout the week, we've brought up the 2011 storm in Texas, similar but not the same. There were a list of recommendations that included winterizing some of this infrastructure. It never really happened. Some of these companies are not going to invest in this sort of thing, which I guess they're hoping it will be a once in a blue moon storm happening more often, but they're not going to invest in it unless they're compelled to. You mentioned that the governor is making that suggestion as well, but is there any conversation about putting a little more teeth into this sort of stuff, really putting pressure on these companies to prepare for the worst case scenario?
Yeah, so Governor Abbott, his comments yesterday, he's calling for the winterization in the grid, and he seemed to suggest that the state legislature should provide some funding for that, or at least help try to fund that. The other thing to note here is that the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which does have some authority to regulate from a federal level, is currently developing standards for winterizing plants. And so that could also be definitely a factor here in making sure that Texas is prepared to withstand future storms like this.
Let's talk about climate change, which is creating new challenges for infrastructures across the country. Texas is obviously seemingly unprepared for this new reality. The question is, how can the state better prepare for future crises? But also, what needs to go into? Is it a question of education? Is it a question of politics when it comes to climate change? I have a very close friend of mine in Texas. He doesn't believe in climate change. And the effects of it are evident as we see them time and time again, not just in the United States, but all around the world. So given that most Texans are skeptical, given most of their elected leaders are skeptical, what needs to be done to prepare the state for future crises?
Right. Well, I spoke with climate scientists earlier this week, and, previous indicators are becoming less useful as we see more intense weather. And even if there is uncertainty around the connections between climate change and cold air outbreaks from the Arctic, climate scientists agree we should really be treating infrastructure design, such as the power grid, with a larger spectrum of possibilities, rather than just thinking that this storm is a rarity, maybe only happens once in 100 years. I think Texans would agree that even if this is the 100th year, we want to make sure that this never happens again. So I think that, as far as climate change goes, this will become a topic of conversation in the Texas legislature. And maybe you don't even need to talk about climate change and have the debate as to whether or not it's man-made or real or any of that. The science is clear that humans are influencing climate change. And so maybe the conversation is just, let's make sure that Texans never experience this sort of disaster again.
Right? At the end of the day, does it really matter what you believe about why this storm has occurred. It's here, that is a fact, and you have to deal with it. And we're seeing this sort of stuff happening over and over again. Listen, before we let you go, I should just get a sense of, what it is like there in terms of the power. I know many people have already gotten their power back. The temperatures are expected to dip into the teens overnight. Are we talking about, full power? Are we still looking at brownouts? Because I'm sure the same level of demand that was there before that caused the brownouts, it's going to be there again, when everything gets back and running. So what's the current status in the state?
Right. So as of yesterday, less than 2% of the Houston area was without power, which is great. That's a significant improvement from earlier this week when almost the whole region was out. And Austin Energy reported Thursday morning that 13% of its energy customers were without power. Again, that's a better improvement than we saw earlier this week. And so power is being restored to people, and I think that these plants are, slowly coming back online. The trick with the electricity grid is that it constantly has to be balanced. So as you bring more supply back online, you can bring more customers back online, but it's a delicate process. You need to kind of ramp that up. And so that's what we're seeing this week. There are also some outstanding local impacts. So if there was any sort of infrastructure that was damaged during the storm, stuff like that, then we have to get crews out there, make sure that those are fixed so that we can restore power to people. So there may be some local impacts where people don't have power quite yet.
Erin Douglas, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.